United States, the federal government estimates that there are 80 million Americans that fall somewhere on the spectrum of severity with problematic substance use. 80 million Americans. Of those 80 million Americans, only 2 million of them each year go into specialty addiction treatment. A tiny fraction. Well, in order to really understand the significance of harm reduction and the difference between an abstinence-only approach and a harm reduction approach, we need to think of it in the context of our models for understanding addiction. The abstinence-based approach really emerges out of Jelinek's disease concept of addiction, which was developed in the early part of the 20th century. And the disease concept is a particular story, a particular narrative, or a particular paradigm for understanding addiction, which essentially says that it is a permanent, chronic, progressive disease that is only arrested by complete and total abstinence. When we look at some studies of outcomes of that traditional abstinence-based treatment system, we see virtually nobody achieving abstinence. There are some studies that show that at 8 weeks, there are 8% of the folks who are completing treatment are actually abstinent. What clinical experience shows us, what reality shows us, that people vary along a spectrum of severity of problematic substance use, a broad spectrum, and people often move up and down this spectrum. The data suggests that we've got this multi-billion-dollar addiction treatment industry, which is an abysmal failure. Trauma also seems to be highly correlated with addiction, so much so that I've begun to think about addiction as a trauma-related problem.
When I was at Bellevue, I'd say that the predominant situation was somebody who had been abused physically, emotionally, sexually in their childhood, and because of that, they had horrendous drug abuse addiction issues. They were alcoholics, they were crack addicts, they were junkies. If you ever read the work of Gabor Mate, he wrote this great book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. He talks about all of his patients had a history of trauma, childhood trauma.
Trauma that fundamentally is that loss of connection with ourselves, with our families, with the world. And then how we adapt to those losses is then what makes us behave in ways that become itself traumatic, because it furthers a loss of connection. So addiction is one adaptation to those emotional losses, but it creates further losses. And I would say that virtually all manner of chronic physical illness, mental illness, addiction, dysfunctional behaviors are adaptations to that disconnection, which is the core of trauma.
One of the primary ways of coping with trauma is dissociation, shutting down, tuning out. That is, to the feelings that are overwhelming, the feelings of terror, the feelings of rage, the feeling of violation, of despair. This has been described by some people as emotional numbing. So I can actually go on with my life. Trauma survivors are left with a sense of profound distrust in others, in intimate relationships. I was betrayed once. Am I likely to be betrayed again?
She was at the end of her rope and I told her that plant medicine would help her in a way that all of this other stuff she had tried before wouldn't. She wouldn't take it because the people in AA said that that was using a drug. and that it would make her sick. And the stigma attached to psychedelics and psychedelic medicine was so great that she didn't want to be associated with it. She didn't believe in it. And I know many of you may think it's tacky to do this, but it's not when you have written an entire book about your 12-year crack addiction and what you did to get out of it, and then you watch your own sister go down the same path when you know better, and you have the solution right there in your hands, and they're too afraid to take it from you because they think it's wrong. They think it's bad, and it might make them crazy if they take it. But they're already crazy and they don't see it, you know?